To speed up our renders, so we can get a little better idea of what we're working with while we're correcting these HyperVoxels problems, I first want to go over to the view interface and just change a couple of the options for our atmosphere. And although the quality is obviously not going to be as high and it's not going to look as realistic, we can definitely increase our render speed by quite a bit. So we're just going to go to the atmosphere editor, and we're going to change this from a spectral model to a standard model. And then I also want to change our lighting model to standard as well. Now you can see we have an extremely bright scene right now. So what I want to do is take our light balance and change that a little more towards sunlight, just to match up sort of along what we currently have with our global illumination and spectral model sky. I'm going to click OK. And now we can go back into layout, and we're going to take a look at another frame, and then we can start taking a look at how to fix this issue. I also want to change our render size, and right now I have 800 by 450, which should be alright and high enough to give us a good idea of what it is we're working with. So we'll go ahead and just render this frame out, and then we can take a look at some of the issues that are caused by the HyperVoxels. Now we can see that all of our HyperVoxels are in front of our view scene, regardless of what should be in front of these HyperVoxels, and that is a current limitation of xStream, and mainly just the way that Lightwave renders our volumetrics, because these are both volumetric plugins, and in this case they are interfering with one another, and there's really no way to get around this overall effect. And one thing to keep in mind too is that all of our reflections, so if we have any reflective objects, they're also going to reflect the scene incorrectly. But there are definitely a couple of things we can do to fix this problem. Although we're not directly fixing it within the main scene, we will be creating a sort of a plate, and that way we can overlay some of the different areas. But what we can mainly fix is definitely our terrain. The only thing that really can't be fixed is our ecosystem. One thing we could do is export our trees from view and have them as objects within Lightwave. The only problem with that is we're not able to use view's wind effects, and we would basically have to set up new animation for all of those wind effects, which is definitely an option if that's something you want to be working with and you want the most realism possible and the most interaction with your plants. But there's something that's definitely much simpler than that, and we're going to take a look at some of those options right now. First of all, we're going to correct just the terrain, and our HyperVoxels will still overlay the current trees that we have, but we'll be able to fix the terrain areas. So let's take a look at that first. And what we want to do is select our object for the high resolution that we had mainly for display, but we can also use that in order to render the scene correctly. The first thing I want to do is just remove this OpenGL by going to the scene editor for our view scene and change that to wireframe. So we're just focusing on the terrain valley that we have. Go to properties, and we want to make sure that we take our object dissolve off now, and I'm going to bring that down to 0. And now we can see that showing up in our scene. We also want to make sure that our low poly that we have for our collision has unseen by camera on, so that it's not rendering in the scene for sure. We can also turn on unseen by rays, radiosity, and unaffected by fog. The object dissolve is currently set to 100%, so we will not see that in the scene whatsoever. If we go back into our terrain valley, we see that we also have self shadow, cast shadow, and receive shadow off, because we don't really need those options on. This is kind of just a trick to get the volumetric plugin around the terrain in order to work correctly. And because our terrain was sized correctly to the terrain within view itself, the only real editing we need to do is just to take our terrain and position it a little bit lower on the y-axis, so just bringing it down. And that way we don't have any parts of the terrain poking through our view terrain. But surprisingly, it will actually fix all of the volumetric problems that we have around the terrain. But like I said, it is still going to show up over our trees. But there are ways, of course, to fix that, and actually they're really simple. So let's go ahead and render this out now that we have this terrain set to render, and it's part of the scene. It's no longer dissolved. So we can go ahead and render that out and take a look at how it fixes our scene. Now we can already see the difference, and mainly if we take a look at one of these peaks we have, we can see it is showing up behind our hypervoxel object, and we can also see the flow of the terrain moving along these lower parts, and all the hypervoxels we had down here at the bottom where the start of the emitter was is now removed. All of the areas on the left over here are now showing up correctly. If we take a look over here on the left, we can see that this peak over here doesn't look like it's really fully rendering correctly, and that may be because our terrain is not lined up perfectly to the scene, and we may actually need to modify the terrain size a little in order for that to fit correctly and reposition it. But right now it still gives you an idea of how to correct this problem directly with the terrain. And what I want to do is keep this render window open, and I'm going to re-render this without that terrain so we can compare back and forth between the previous render and the current one. So I want to go to our Objects panel and Objects Properties for our terrain valley and set our Object Dissolve, or we can just check Unseen by Camera and Unseen by Rays, and then we can render out the new frame. And now we have that frame rendered, so we can switch back and forth and see the huge difference that we get by being able to overlay those hypervoxels and just switching back and forth so you can really see that. But once again, the trees are not being covered up. So we needed to correct that. And there's a couple of different ways. Like I was saying before, we can bring in objects directly from view and have them active and rendered within Lightwave. But of course we don't get the special effects options that we have available in view. So there is a much easier way where we can still get a lot of realism from the scene and not have to worry about creating all those extra objects.